Well, hello everyone. I cannot believe I am saying this, but welcome to our very last lecture of the semester. Starting off with some really cool species of the day. First, a reef stonefish, super deadly, extremely toxic venom that can cause heart failure. Camouflage describes itself in a coral reef, eats small shrimp, crustaceans as they swim by, uses that camouflage to hunt and stay safe. I think their toxins would help that process. We got the western hognose snake. They've got a slightly blunt nose on them. Um, it's a good snake. Eat lots of prey items, rodents and such. They live in sandy or gravelly soils, prairies, floodplains, scrublands, grasslands, semi-deserts, and some agricultural areas. And apparently you can get these guys as pets. This one I've never heard of before. Thank you, Gavin, for the panda ant. It's a tiny little wingless wasp that is the color of a panda. Very cute. And thank you, Sabana, for plankton. Very unique choice for wildlife here. But yes, as we've been talking about our different trophic groups, very critical step in the trophic cascades, eaten by many small aquatic animals. They don't swim, they just drift in the current along the surface. They use photosynthesis to get energy, and I believe they are little plants, but cool nonetheless. So, today's lecture is a little different than the previous ones. This one was a lecture by Jeffrey Smith, a PhD candidate who also is a teacher of this course at University of Washington. And this was a lecture that he shared specifically on his research and work. I've been reading through it. I think I can do it some justice. Obviously, I'm not the researcher, but hopefully we can better understand the work that he does in his research as part of his PhD. So, the title Penguins, Pumas, and Foxes, a Conservation Conundrum in South America. So we're not going to wrap up a solution, but we're going to look at how complicated his research and work is. So we're going to talk about the species that are involved in the areas of Argentina where he researched, and what those species kind of interactions were, the work that he did, and potential management approaches that he came up with. So here you can see the 6 different species. I'm going to forget the name of those 2 bottom ones, but we've got a hare here. We've got sheep being raised as livestock. We've got pumas, the Magellanic penguins, and then 2 different foxes, and I can't remember their names, so we'll find them on the next or one of the future slides. So the European hare was that first picture. About 100 hares were introduced in the late 1800s. Guys, we constantly hear stories of hares going somewhere and being an invasive species. They're one of the most numerous mammals on Earth, and they are invasive almost everywhere they live. They are very adaptable and do very well. So in the 1800s, late 1800s, about 100 hares were released in these 3 locations. By 1907, it was an agricultural pest, and farmers were killing 5 to 10 million a year. And look at that span now in 2010. So huge growth, huge growth. Another species that was involved in the research and all the work that he did was domesticated sheep. About 100 years ago, farmers started farming sheep in this land, and as a result, they had to control predators that would try to eat the sheep. It caused predator numbers to lower or to literally move away from the aggressions of the farmers. However, in the last 10 years or so, raising sheep has become less profitable in the inner area, but it's still practiced near the coast. So the location of sheep farming has changed in the last 10 years or so. Another species that researchers were looking at were puma. Puma in Argentina have had a relatively stable population and a very wide range, both for individuals and all the different individuals. When you look at where they are in Argentina, they're all over the place. They did disappear from the coast for the most part about 100 years ago, but the numbers of puma are increasing again. This one I couldn't remember was the Colpio fox. It's the second largest canid in Argentina. It's an opportunistic carnivore. It kind of takes advantage of opportunity for any kind of meal it can find. It's the size of a coyote, and they're seeing that its range is expanding. And as it does expand into a range, it kind of out competes smaller competitors, and they end up dying off or having to move because they can't find enough food due to the Copio foxes hunting. So here is where Copio foxes' ranges were in 1902. Again, this is when hares were newer to the area. They have since expanded. This is where they were in 2006. And again, that entire area where they expanded are areas where hares are involved. So we can imagine that as they had a more readily multiplying food source, they were able to expand into other areas because there was food in those areas. And then we have the Argentine gray fox. This is a smaller fox than the Culpio. It does have a wide range, but they are disappearing from sections of that range. And again, they're disappearing from sections where the Culpio is moving in because it is able to outcompete them for food. Another species involved, we've already talked about these guys, is the Magellanic penguins. We know that these penguins can live many, many years. They nest in large colonies. They are threatened, and they spend about half a year on land making nests and raising young, and the other half a year in the water bulking up and eating. We talked about that with the MPA. So, um, but until about 100 years ago, there actually weren't any penguins on land. They all were able to do their colony nesting on islands. And so about 100 years ago, they spread to the continent. So a lot of different changes were happening about 100 years ago. And so part of this research was trying to figure out what's driving the changes in the Culpio foxes moving in, pushing the gray foxes out. Why are the pumas returning to the coast? Why are the penguins at the coast? And so a lot of it is just taking some guesses and trying to figure it out. So again, remember those European hares started in 3 different locations and have just gone crazy, basically the whole southern part of South America. And the foxes are taking a little longer, but they're expanding their range, the Culpio foxes, and they're following along regions where the hares are. And again, they're outcompeting the gray foxes. The gray foxes are either dying off or moving, or there are smaller populations as well. So ranges change with animals. As some food species move, the predators are going to move with them. So from the late 1800s until about 2000, livestock and sheep in the inner areas of Argentina was big business. And with that came the need for predator control. And so farmers would shoot the foxes that would be trying to kill the sheep. And so these images show foxes that have died, but basically, the idea that their numbers couldn't grow too big because they were being guarded, the sheep were being guarded by the farmers. And during the same time, about 100 years ago, the predator control along the coastline stopped. So the pumas were not being hunted by people because they were not interacting with the sheep. They kind of moved to the coastlines, potentially because the penguins had moved to the coastlines. And so that became a safe place where they could hunt without interacting with humans as much and having that challenge of the human aggressors. So these new colonies of penguins started to form. And there wasn't any predator control happening over there because there wasn't farming happening in these areas. So the pumas moved over to the coast. Um, so then, about 10 years ago to the present, they stopped raising as many sheep inland. It wasn't as profitable. So they stopped killing off the predators in that area as well. And so again, remember, sheep wasn't their only food source. They also have hares. And so those predators' numbers were allowed to rebound without human controlling them. And now what we're seeing is the decrease of predators being controlled means those foxes and things are doing better in inland, and we're seeing that the pumas go inland to breed. So it makes sense that they're going to look for a bigger meal as a bigger animal. They're moving in and they're actually hunting some of these predator animals, not just the hares, in order to have rich food sources when they are breeding and raising their young. So this is all what's happening inland. We used to have inland ranches. We no longer do. So as those inland ranches disappeared, they stopped killing the Culpio foxes. The Culpio foxes are doing really well. pumas go there to eat the Kuopio foxes to raise their young. Along the coastline now, we still have active ranches. Some of them have moved there. It's more profitable. With that comes them controlling some of the fox populations and predator populations there. And another thing that also exists nearby on the coast is the Magellanic penguins. So what they see is these animals are doing well, kind of living inland. They don't, or for the most part, they might go try to hunt a sheep, but they're not going to live near the farmers being predators of them. And then the pumas are also going to be hunting the foxes that are doing well inland as well. Now they can immigrate for food resources, but they basically begin kind of in the central area. Oh, so the central area becomes a source for these animals, and then the coastline becomes the sink. So if you remember, the source is sort of areas where they breed and begin, and the sink is the area where they might move to and die. So here's a picture of what the range might look like. So if a source was here, just space-wise, a Kuopio can travel up to or over 90 kilometers, a Puma 200 kilometers. And so they really can move inland and towards the coastline a decent amount. And so about 10 years ago, pumas have returned to the coast. We know the penguins are living there as well, and the Kuopio foxes expanded as well. Um, Now, before that, prior to 2006, so before the 10 years ago mark, um, there were smaller predators that lived along the coast. The Argentine gray fox, like we said, which is a much smaller one, has a wide range. It's about the size of a small red fox. The Pampas cat, which is a small little cat, again, wide range, camouflage, about the size of a house cat. And the Jeffries cat, another small cat with a wide range, camouflaged, and about the size of a house cat. So these were the biggest predators that were living by the coast prior to about 2006 when the Kuopio foxes and the pumas started coming to the coast for food. And so, what it used to be was that all three of these could predate on the penguins that had moved there about a year ago. The penguins were their food source of choice, but they also could have eaten these other guys. As the Kuopio fox moves in, the Kuopio fox actually hunts the Jeffrey cat and the Pampas cat, and those are the ones that hunts the penguin. The puma came in as an apex predator. It hunts the cats, and it also hunts the Kuopio fox, and it hunts the penguins and the basically all the different food sources. And so that changed the structure of the trophic structure and can cause cascading effects on the populations of all of these different groups of animals. So, the research that Jeffrey Smith did was looking at the predation that was happening along the coast. And what they found was that more animals were being killed, but there was not a huge increase in the predator density. There weren't tons more predators living in the area. And so the scientist's job was to try to figure out why. And so what they were noticing was part of the problem is certain species are beginning to disappear from the coast with those new predators moving in. The gray foxes are disappearing. Skunks, native ferrets, and other animals are disappearing. Besides that, penguins are declining, and penguins are something that's not just important for wildlife and trophic levels, but it's important for money and the economy in Argentina because penguins equal tourism. And we know that penguins are not endemic, right? They are not natural to the land. They moved there about 100 years ago from the islands. So they're relatively new. And so part of the research was, is it the presence of the penguins that are changing some of these behaviors? What's going on? And so some of the management issues. First of all, there is definite evidence that the Kuopio foxes expanded following the hares. As hares took off across Argentina, they did a good job. They know that Kuopios are better at competing for food than gray foxes. And they also know that Kuopios are big enough to eat both penguins and sheep as well. So they moved into an area following hares. They succeeded very well because they did a better job hunting than gray foxes. And then they found a plethora of food in the coastal sheep and penguins as well. So, another thing to consider when you're doing this environmental research is they like to make sure that what animals belong, what animals are invasive and maybe don't belong. And pumas historically did used to live on the coast. Pumas do kill penguins and they do kill sheep, but as an animal that is endemic to the area, they're considered more to have more of a right to be there and to be doing that. So the biggest issue, though, was that penguins make money. And when more than 5,000 penguins die in 1 year, that's going to be a problem. Penguins are not natural to the area. The gray fox has disappeared as the Kulpios have moved in. The pumas have returned, which is considered a good environmental thing. The Kulpios have arrived because they were following the hares. Hares are everywhere all over Argentina. And there's this source sink dynamic that has changed the community structure. There's animals that wouldn't necessarily be living here, or some that are living in one place, moving into another, and it has changed the different structures that are happening. So we've seen images of the Punta Tomba colony, and you can see it here, them living along the rocks. We know that this project has been going on since 1982, and they are basically there the 6 months that the penguins are there. They've been able to ban over 60,000 penguins, and they have 2.5 million records of penguin movements, which is very valuable research. They're looking at the reproduction rates of the penguins and all of the stuff that's going on. So, ways that scientists do that could be through beach surveys, counting mating pairs or nests that they see. They do census circles. Well, they'll take a big rope and make a big circle and see how many penguins they can see in a certain round area. And they also do their best to monitor adults, especially weight, because remember, weight tells a lot about the food access to food and how healthy they are. But specifically, what Jeff Smith's work was about the dead penguins, the penguins that didn't make it. So his job was to find dead penguins through really carefully planned searches and look for opportunities to learn about predation on penguins. And so they could determine what type of animal killed a penguin based on puncture wounds, the type of bleeding or injuries that it had, and they also did DNA samples to actually try to get DNA from the predator that killed it from the saliva. So when he found a dead penguin, he would weigh it and measure it and try to get information about its age and things like that. He would study its dead body for facts, taking DNA swabs, like I said before, and trying to learn anything he could about the last meals the penguins had and all kinds of details. And so one summer he found 166 penguins, and he would mark the location of each of those penguin deaths and put it on a map to do some research. And so he would compare those then, the death of penguins to where penguins are living in more or less dense areas, the landscape features where the dead penguins were found, and the amount of vegetation covering the land where the dead penguins were found. And what he found was that each year, the number of adult penguins killed was increasing generally. And he noted that this was coming along with the disappearance of smaller carnivores. So the smaller carnivores being gone meant that penguins became the appropriate food source for the larger, hungrier animals where hares just weren't cutting it. So, next steps in his research is looking at different landscapes and predicting where future killings could happen, doing those DNA analyses and figuring out what animals are indeed doing the killing, and try to sort of manage the issues based on that. So, some of the management options he and his team were considering is just leaving it as is and letting things happen the way they're going to happen. Restoration, which is trying to restore an area to its original state. I don't know if they could stop making the penguins come on land, but allowing pumas, but maybe trying to control the culpios so that the smaller animals are back would have been an option. Actively trying to manage the site and brainstorming other species. So this is the kind of work that a PhD candidate would do, and then they would write a paper with all their evidence and data, kind of making next steps and get published and continue on in the field of research in animal wildlife. So thanks so much for listening, guys. I miss you already.